Welcome everyone. This is AP US History Period 3 Review. This is going to be a two-part lecture, with the first part being 1754 through 1786. What that's going to cover today is the French-Indian War through the Revolution and up to Shay's Rebellion, with the second part being focused on the Constitution and also the Federalist era with Washington and Adams presidencies. This will take us, for this part of the review, part 1, in Brinkley's chapter 4 and chapter 5. So let's get started right away. With this section, this is the first section the AP typically will have on the DBQ. And this section usually plays out in regards to what sort of builds up to the Revolution and the effects of that on American society with Shay's Rebellion, the Articles of Confederation. So there is a lot of play in here when it comes to writing. And again, there is a lot of, again, what builds up with the French-Indian War, the buildup of tensions to lead to the Revolution, and then the aftermath of the Revolution itself, the political, social, economic changes that do take place over that time period. Okay, so the first thing really talks about in this time period is the Albany Congress, which is this grouping of American colonies that came together at the request of Benjamin Franklin. He wanted to create a sort of this Congress and plan to put into place to meet the colonies together to deal with Western land expansion and dealing with the Native Americans, especially the Iroquois this time period. He also wanted to create an informal grouping of colonies, just sort of like the Confederacy of the Iroquois were together. And this was sort of for two reasons. Again, to help with the brokering of Western land assessment and expansion to the West, but also sort of in connection to getting ready for the potential French and Indian War that was to come. He wanted to create a colonial assembly with the purpose of defense against the Native Americans. And this plan will ultimately fail, but it does get the colonies started to come together during times of tension, which will be a major thing that happens during the Revolutionary War period. A cartoon that he drew for this in the Pennsylvania Gazette was this really famous one, the Join or Die, with the separated snake with all the different colonial units. Again, this was to sort of to promote a colonial union and membership prior to the French-Indian War. The French-Indian War doesn't really come up too much on the AP test in itself. There is a lot of attention played onto it on how this will end solitary neglect. So this is the Great War for Empire, the French-Indian War, the 7 Years' War. And this is going to be a war between the French and Native Americans who have a very large sort of settlement throughout the Americas, throughout Canada, the Mississippi Valley, and all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, and the British and the American colonists. Eventually, at the end of this war, the British will win, and they will sign the Treaty of Paris in 1763 to end this war. The major thing that you really need to know about this war is the ending of it, and especially how this gave England two major things. One, it gave England huge amounts of land holdings that American colonists will then want to expand into. The second thing is it's going to put the British heavily into debt, which is going to pose future problems in dealing with American colonies. So in this war, basically what's going to happen, you have this huge French holding over here, and in this war, all the area that is basically east of the Mississippi River is going to be given to the American colonies and the British. Anything that's west of this land is going to be basically Spanish holdings. And here's a better look at that. So in this Treaty of Paris, it will end the French-Indian War, and all this pink area right here is going to be new land that is basically given to the British and the American colonies. And of course, the American colonists, because of, especially in the New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts region, there's very tight areas. There's not enough land for the colonists that are there. So many of them are going to want to go into this newly developed land and basically settle in this newly area that's now open to them, especially along this Ohio River Valley and up into this area of where present-day Detroit is. So this whole area basically where present-day Ohio is, they're going to want to expand into. The problem with that is that there's a lot of Native Americans living there. And with the expansion will also come engagement and interaction between natives and settlers, which is going to cause many Native Americans to rise up under Chief Pontiac and create a series of rebellions and raids against American British forts to combat this rise of settlement in this area. These rebellions will be put down, which is important to know, but here's the big thing, that this is going to require a huge amount of military cost to protect this area. The British, remember, were in heavy debt at the end of the French-Indian War, and they didn't want to expend this money to deal with the cost of the protection. So what they did, they enacted the Proclamation of 1763. What this proclamation did, it put a boundary. It put a boundary right on this little line right there on the crest of the Appalachian Mountains that forbid American settlers from moving westward. This was a huge amount of resentment, and pretty much there was a lot of non-compliance also. American settlers still move westward, just not officially and not actually with land ownership. And this will start the huge amounts of tension that are going to be coming with the really first major act that is placed onto the Americans. Prior to this, though, for a couple years prior to this, a couple things of note that you should know about. One is the tension that was developing in the American colonies even without anything to do with the British. Here's one example. It's rarely tested on, but it's something you can use within your essay as contextualization about the tension between colonists and stuff like that. So the Paxton Boys were a group of Western Pennsylvania's natives Western Pennsylvania settlers and American colonists who basically attacked natives and wanted protection from the colonies themselves. And so to get that protection, they marched on Philadelphia, showing their displeasure. And the government, including Benjamin Franklin, gave concessions to them, and the rebellion was averted. But what this did do, which is really important to note, it did highlight the tensions between the rich and the poor in American colonies, especially the tension between Western settlers and the more Eastern elites. So just because there is also the British and American tensions going on, there was also American tensions going on too in the same time period. And a lot of the things that will be gained within the revolution are going to be gained for the more elite and the coastal areas more so than the western areas. So one of the questions that is often played on this, was the Revolutionary War truly revolutionary? Did it actually make massive changes for the lives of Americans? And this is one case you could say, no, it actually didn't do major change because the elite were still the elite and the landless or the poor were still the poor. Okay, now we get back to the British. One thing the British wanted to deal with is the massive smuggling and non-compliance of the Navigation Acts. They wanted to crack down on the Molasses Act and the Sugar Act and actually start enforcing those. So what the British did is enact something called the Writs of Assistance, which allowed the British officials to search dwellings, warehouses, ships without official warrants. And the whole point was to find the smuggled goods. And then once they found them, then they could basically take these violators into a court of law. One of the people that was in charge of this, a guy named James Otis, immediately resigned his post, and he took up legal action against the British. He wrote his famous Against the Writs of Assistance, lambasting the British and how this is a major violation of colonial rights. This will eventually be a major contextualization piece that will go into why we created the Fourth Amendment, which was the whole amendment that basically protects us against illegal searches and seizures of our property. To deal with these smugglers, or the ones that are caught for smuggling, the British will also set up something called the Vice Admiralty Courts. And again, this was part of the Sugar Act of 1764. And the whole point of this was to design to basically deter smugglers from bringing in and smuggling illegal sugar. So this actually will produce a lack of tax or a reduction of tax on sugar, but they're going to start really enforcing this using the Writs of Assistance, and then once caught, taking these smugglers or these violators into custody and trying them in these Vice Admiralty Courts, which again, the biggest thing is going to deprive them of local juries, which will be a great piece to use for context in regards to that that you could talk about the Fifth, Sixth, or Seventh Amendments, all about the rights of criminals, the rights of basically the process of trial with juries. Okay, the Stamp Act, that's a big one. That's one that is always on the AP test. The Stamp Act of 1765 will be this major act that Americans will sort of rally behind and really have a more universal response against the British. The Stamp Act was a tax on printed materials to offset the British troops and the war debt that they had to protect America. This was an internal tax, meaning that this was a tax on American goods, not external trade. So again, this was sort of a conceptually different tax than those Navigation Acts, the Sugar Act, and stuff like that. So the effects of this they thought was much different because again, it was a different types of tax where they thought that only the colonies should be able to tax their own citizens, not the British itself. So the effects of the Stamp Act was that we have a group of men, called the Sons of Liberty, formed to harass stamp collectors. We had a huge amount of support with a Congress called the Stamp Act Congress. Patrick Henry, for example, gave his famous speech against the British right here. 9 of the 13 colonies met in New York City to deal with what are American colonies going to do to go against this Stamp Act. And what they came up with is that Americans should not allow taxation without a representation. They wanted to be actually represented rather than this virtual representation that they were having. And the decision was to boycott British goods until basically the British merchants were hurt enough to force the Parliament to repeal these acts, which they did. The Parliament eventually will repeal acts because the merchants were hurting financially by losing this trade. The repeal of the Sugar and Stamp Acts will be done with also the Declaratory Act being slipped in there to reassure Parliament and the King that has ultimate authority over the colonies. So again, they do repeal the Sugar and the Stamp Act, but they also put in the Declaratory Act, which is an act that Parliament's authority over the colonies, which therefore the King's authority over the colonies is the same, is all cases whatsoever. So it gives the Parliament continued authority to enact acts or legislation or laws against the colonies themselves. And they do that a year later with the Townshend duties. It's going to be a new tax on lead, paint, paper, tea, to name a few of them. It was an external tax, and again, the whole purpose was to raise revenue to offset the cost of the more redcoats in America, and also to help defray the cost of the past French-Indian War. To combat this, basically the colonies continued to boycott. They put a new round of boycotts on British goods. Eventually, the Townshend Acts theory will be repealed. These will be all repealed except for the taxes on tea. And the British had gone too far. Most colonists had started to become disillusioned with the British Empire, and we start seeing more heated tensions and more rising tensions. To deal with these rising tensions, especially in New England, we're going to see more redcoats being placed into the American colonies, which will lead to, again, to more tensions. Again, this will come up in Boston and also New York City. Other couple things that do come up sometimes in AP tests is the Letters from a Farmer, which is by John Dickinson. This is basically to help unite the colonists against the Townshend duties. He disagreed with the Parliament taxing the colonists to raise revenue, but again reiterated the colonist rights to still tax the colonies to raise revenue within, because again, he's basically said that the colonies themselves are taxing the colonists and raising revenue. Therefore, there should not be an extra tax on the colonies themselves. The Boston Massacre will be another thing that ramps up tensions between the British and the colonists. This basically is where in Boston, five colonists will be killed after a rowdy sort of a mix-up between both redcoats and dock workers. John Adams will defend the soldiers that killed the men because he said that every single man deserves a fair trial regardless of their guilt. Again, this is going to play into the part of our Fifth Amendment, basically saying that every single person deserves legal counsel. But again, we see that increased colonial tensions, and also you see that this is going to be this very famous engraving that's done by Paul Revere. That is quite often on AP test, where you see the colonists unarmed there, just very peace-abiding colonists and citizens being accosted and abused by this armed British redcoats. Obviously, this is a great piece to use author on and to look at the bias of the author on this piece. It is extremely biased, the point of view of this is extremely in favor of the colonists. Paul Revere was a staunch patriot living in Boston, had a lot of animosity against the redcoats. So this is a perfect one to use who the author is and why that matters when it comes to the viewing of this engraving. After this, the committees of correspondence will be set up by Samuel Adams. Again, the main point of this was to basically use as a colonial post almost, not a post office, but to spread information from colony to colony faster than the information could spread back to England. So it was to create more unity against the British and to spread information back and forth from one colonial area to another colonial area. Okay, this is where it gets really heated up. The Tea Act of 1773 will actually be a reduction of tax for the British East Indian Company. Again, it will keep the tea tax intact for the rest of the tea companies, and it was to help relieve their financial burdens and prevent bankruptcy for this company. What this did is actually show that the British could do really whatever they wanted to the Bostonians and the Americans, and they erupted because of this. You have this famous Boston Tea Party because of this, where Sons of Liberty dressed up as Mohawk Native Americans, stuck onto the ships such as the Dartmouth, and threw hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of tea into Boston Harbor. In retaliation of this, the British will put onto the colonies their most strict and intolerable acts will be called. These were called the coercive acts by the British, but Americans will label these the intolerable act. It will actually be 5 different acts. The Port Act will close the Port of Boston. The Government Act will close assemblies in Massachusetts. The Quartering Act will basically put more Boston and more redcoats into Boston. The Justice will take all criminal cases off the coast and into England. And the Quebec Act will allow the spread of Catholicism and opening up the interior part of America to basically French-Canadian expansion. Not French-Canadian, British-Canadian expansion. In response to this, the Americans will come together with the First Continental Congress. So this is going to be a meeting of 12 of the 13 colonies. Georgia will not be there. They'll meet in Philadelphia in 1744. And basically this is a reaction to the Intolerable Acts right there. They're going to condemn the Intolerable Acts or the Coercive Acts. They're going to agree to a British boycott of all British goods. They will also agree to make military preparations against the possible attack by the British. This is not an army, but again, to make sort of the military preparation within the colony's militias. They also agreed to meet again next spring. At this meeting, they will also write the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which King George will ignore these new demands that the American colonies will make upon them. Before that second meeting in 1775, the British will basically set out on a search and destroy mission of colonial goods from Boston. They're going to march to Concord to destroy a colonial armory or basically stockpile of weapons. On the way there, they're going to be ambushed by British militia or Minutemen, they're called. Shots will be fired. The redcoats will leave the scene. On the way back is when the militia and the Minutemen will really start plucking off and engaging with the redcoats. The redcoats will lose hundreds of men on this, and by the time they get back, war will have erupted. It will be commanded by General Thomas Gage. So this is, you could say, the famous quote by Henry David Thoreau in this poem, "The shot heard around the world." And again, you could say that this is the official start of the Revolutionary War. Okay, now the war itself. This is Brinkley chapter 5. And in this war, it starts with the Second Continental Congress. After this battle, this Congress will meet in Philadelphia and now decide, well, the war is imminent. How do we deal with the war? What do we need to deal with? There will be this last-ditch effort called the Olive Branch Petition that will be proposed by John Dickinson and the Pennsylvania representatives, which will plead to the king for some type of process of reconciliation, basically a process of deal with the issue without going to war. It will only be seen by the king and rejected. So in this, we're going to have Lee's resolution. Lee's resolution will have to be doing two things. American government must create a Declaration of Independence and write one. We also must create a new government. We'll set a committee on the Declaration of Independence. We'll also set a committee on making a new form of government, which is going to be called the Articles of Confederation. Also, we are going to create a new colonial army called the Continental Army, led by George Washington. While this was happening, Thomas Paine, a British native who had been born an Englishman but came to America, wrote his really famous Common Sense that basically accuses the king and blames the king for the problems and being autocratic against American colonies. And it supports the idea of an American revolution to split itself from the British crown. Over 100,000 copies will be printed and sold, which means hundreds of thousands of Americans are reading and then sort of believing in these ideas of this revolution. So it's going to get many Americans that are on the fence on board when it comes to supporting a revolutionary war and a movement against the British. And a lot of the same themes will also be used in the Declaration of Independence. It'll be written by Thomas Jefferson with the help from Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Livingston, and Roger Sherman. They will hold themselves up for a couple of months to write this. And in this Declaration of Independence, natural rights are going to be listed, or the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness from John Locke. You're going to have a list of grievances that are going to be a list of all those things that King George did that were atrocious. It's going to condemn King George III and label him a tyrant. Eventually, we're going to see it being signed July 4th, 1776, this being the official start of independence for America. And there's that and the famous drafting picture of those five men. We'll get to the Articles of Confederation a little later on in this lecture. So at the very start of this war, England had all the conceptual advantages. They had one of the strongest militaries in the world, the strongest navy in the world, one of the strongest economies in the world. They had more weapons, more money, more gunpowder. They were run by strong generals. They had all the things going for them that you could think of. A few things they didn't, though, which were the American advantages. Americans had a strong leader in George Washington. They obviously had the home people advantage, which means that so therefore the British had 3,000 miles to basically deal with supply lines. Americans eventually will figure out that using British methods was not going to work when it comes to battle tactics. So they had to use ungentlemanlike or unorthodox battle tactics like sabotage, ambush, and other things that was like hit and run type of scenarios. We're going to give them more the advantage of surprise. Also, the Americans were going to be fighting for a passionate reason, basically a reason for a new country, a new livelihood, a new democratic theory. Okay, the war itself does not get tested on much. If it does, there's only a couple points that typically get brought up. One may be the advantage and disadvantage of American and British authorities. Valley Forge is one thing that does come up sometimes, which was the winter encampment right outside of Philadelphia. Horrible conditions, many deaths, and that could come up. The biggest thing that will come up, though, is the Battle of Saratoga as a turning point of the war. This is where we see General Burgoyne marching down from the areas of Canada down to help New York out. On the way there, he is ambushed, surprise attacked by Americans, and lost this battle. By winning this battle, the Americans will gain huge amounts of British clothing and weapons and stockpiles. They will basically keep American colonies united rather than having to split between a New England colony and a Southern colonies. And the biggest thing is that After this battle, the French are going to ally themselves with the Americans, which means huge amounts of money, gunpowder, shot, and eventually the use of the French Navy, which is going to be able to harass British supply lines on the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, some more of the bigger figures of the war itself. Women did play a major part of this war, not so much in the battle themselves, but at home. They were a big part of increasing the amount of homespun goods or clothing they were making. They took greater roles within the management of households and farms on the local scale. They also were camp followers who would follow the American camps to help with nursing and wounds, to help with cooking, to help with other things, to deal with the behind-the-lines scenes within the soldiers themselves. Loyalists played a big part in this war too. They made up about a third of American country, roughly about 20 to 30% roughly, with a big part of it up in British Canada and also down in the deep south. A lot of them fled at this time to Canada or Britain. So we did lose a lot of Americans who were these loyalists. When you were found out to be a loyalist, they had a huge amount of resentment and huge sort of horrible conditions that were put to them. When the war ended, the Treaty of Paris did state that all rights and property had to be given back to these loyalists, even if there was still this animosity. Some of the effects of this war on the economy. One, this actually was really good for, sorry about that. So one of these things was the economic effects that this will have on the war itself. So this war is going to basically open up new markets for American shipping. It will also encourage Americans to grow and diversify, with more importance being put on American homespun goods. So it's going to make America more diverse, as less a just supplier of raw materials for the British to a maker of raw materials and into actual goods themselves. It's also going to increase American partnership between different colonial regions, or now states, and increase that a little bit. Financing war. This is going to be a tough one for Americans. Americans had very or no hard currency whatsoever. And so Congress had no authority to tax the people under the Articles of Confederation. So what the Congress had to do is print huge amounts of money called continental currency, causing rapid inflation. And what this did, it drove up the prices of goods, causing huge amount of problems paying for these goods. It also caused the lack of goods for Continental Army. Even though America was in bounty of grain and foodstuffs, the Continental Army had very little ability to actually purchase those goods because no one would trust this Continental currency. So that's going to be one of the major things that eventually Alexander Hamilton is going to have to deal with in this new government after the Constitution is formed, is how to get America back financially with all this rising and this inflation that happened because of the printing of this continental currency. How did the wars help or hurt different groups? For example, it did hurt the Anglican Church because so many of the Anglicans were loyalists, many of them fled, and so that the overall numbers will go down. It hurt the Quaker because of their pacifist beliefs. It hurt the natives because obviously with Americans winning and owning that new land was going to be opened up to expansion, thus driving many of the natives out of this new land. It did slightly help Catholics in America because of the French involvement and the alliance with the French. And slaves had a mixed bag. Some were freed because of the British. However, though, most will still remain slaves. So this war did not really help the slaves out. And if you did get a question about how revolutionary was this war, a great way to play this is that it did not help the African Americans or women out pretty much at all. Life in America pretty much stayed the same for African slaves, especially African Americans and African slaves, and women. And it also stayed the same for a lot of American men also, especially people that were not landowners. Okay, now we get into the very last part of this about our government during the war and then right after the war itself. Okay, so our government was called the Articles of Confederation. They made this government intentionally very weak. They made it with most of the power concentrated with the states, not the national government. The reason they did this is because many of the Americans were very fearful of a strong federal government because they just came from a strong federal government with the king and parliament. So they set this up intentionally weak, which also was a problem of it. This new government had no power to tax. They could request money from the states, but they couldn't demand it. In Congress, every state had one representative, therefore also one vote, which gave a huge benefit to small states, small population states. So it was very unfair for large states like Virginia or Massachusetts or New York. There was no president or executive branch and no national court system. So that was very weak when it came to one person deciding sort of the role of American policy. Also very weak because there's no judicial branches to deal with disputes among citizens or different states themselves. Also, this was not United States this time period. States could put tariffs on each other's goods, could tax each other, could do different things to stop balance between different states. But one benefit of this is it did hold the country together until the Constitution was written, and it did allow for change. One thing that this Articles did do very successfully, one piece of legislation, was the Land Ordinance and the Northwest Ordinances. These ordinances, what they did, this Land Ordinance of 1785, it was a policy of surveying Western lands. So it was very detailed, very regimented, very organized, where it broke up Western land in these the grid-like pattern blocks. And it was a very systematic way of selling off and land to settlers and eventually to territories. Also, what was really good in the Western area is that you're going to have one block of land set aside for public education. So it was going to be in the Northwest, a larger emphasis eventually will be put on public education than will be in the South because of this land ordinances. The Northwest Ordinances written by Thomas Jefferson was slightly different, but again, it's all sort of part of the same grouping of ordinances that help with dealing with Western land settlement. All this area up here is going to be banned to slavery. So right along this Ohio River is going to be the ban. Everything north of it will be free. Everything south of it will be able to become slave based on the will of the territory. They're going to grant religious freedom and trial by jury in this area. This is before the Bill of Rights. And this is going to be a very successful way to systematically create Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So eventually 5 states will come out of this. Again, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. There'll be a little bit of Minnesota way up here that's going to be part of this also. And there's another picture of this, and the 5 states eventually will become states from these territories. Okay, flaws in the Articles. The flaws in the Articles was one thing is that the government was very limited on were they able to raise a militia or raise an army to put down rebellions. What happened in Western Massachusetts? What was happening is that the state of Massachusetts was putting huge taxes on these Western farmers. And this time you could go to prison for not paying your debts. And so a Western rebellion rose up to combat this. So farmers protested high taxes, lack of printed currency, and imprisonment. Daniel Shays led this rebellion, and the American government was unable to raise an army to combat it. So the Massachusetts militia had to stop it, which they were able to stop it pretty successfully. But it showed the problems of what happens if this was a larger rebellion. So it showed the country the need for a stronger federal government. So what's going to happen is that these Americans are going to come together in something called the Annapolis Convention, which is going to lead to the creation of a new constitution. At the start, though, they weren't going into it to create a brand new government. They were going into it to make some tweaks and changes to therefore then get a new government going, or at least an adapted government going. And that'll be our next part. We'll be dealing with the Constitution and the new Federalist era under Washington and Adams. Okay, here is the last couple slides, potential essay question for the 2020 Period 3 DBQ. So this was created by Tom Ritchie under the Ritchie Publications for this new adapted 2020 DBQ. So let's read this, and then here are the steps to break down the DBQ, and then we'll get into what the rubric is itself on this PowerPoint. Okay, so the first thing you do when you look at a DBQ, you break down the prompt. Take 30 seconds to break down the prompt, what is being asked, and what is needed for the thesis. This is huge. You want to get your thesis point. And the biggest problem we see of kids not getting the thesis point is typically that they're forgetting to do one part of the prompt or forgetting to put in reasoning to back up their thesis. After you do that, you're going to do a brain drain, a quick, short little writing down of any information you can think of that could go into this as outside evidence. In this regards, in this new adapted test, this is not as important because you do have material that you can use on the test. If you have a good timeline or good sources of vocabulary words that you could use, quickly you would want to turn that your notes to this section of time period, and that's going to be your brain drain. And then you're going to read and annotate the documents at hand. There'll be 5 documents in this new updated version. And in these steps, you're going to want to take no longer than 15 minutes. And I would even recommend try to push that as close to 10 minutes as possible. Okay, for this DBQ, for the one we're going to be doing, it is evaluate the relative importance of different causes for the rising tensions between American colonists and the British government in the periods of 1754 to 1776. So they want you to stop at the Declaration of Independence, and they want you to start right at the start of the French Indian War there. So again, those are your benchmark days. Again, so you're not going to talk about the revolution itself, and you're not really going to talk much about pre-French Indian War stuff unless you use that as synthesis or contextualization. Okay, evaluate means to look at very closely, and you're going to look at the importance of different causes. So you want to see there's going to be several different causes. So we're looking at that there is more than one here. So again, rule of thumb typically is 3. You want to look at least 3 different causes that contribute to the rising tensions that happen between the colonists and the British themselves. Again, you can have more than 3, but you would really try hard not to have less than 3 here. In your DBQ, it is on a 10-point scale this year, so slightly different. So in a response, of course, you want a historically defensible thesis with a line of reasoning. That means your starting of argumentation here. You're going to want some arguments that you're going to break down, not specific arguments, but showing the reader where you're going within your essay. And again, the rule of thumb is you want at least 3 lines of reasoning in these DBQs. Okay, for 1 point, you want to use contextualization to describe a broader historical context relevant to the prompt. Typically, I would go right before the time period. A great thing to do is talk about the age of solitary neglect that happens right before the French Indian War. And that's a great way to segue into the tension that erupts after the French Indian War. For 1 point, you're going to describe 2 of the 5 documents. I would highly recommend doing at least 3, though, to be safe. Okay, that's 1 point, 2 points, 3 points. So now to get your other points, you're going to support an argument with at least 2 documents for 1 point, and with additional, let's do that, I did that wrong, there we go, with additional point being earned for using 4 documents. So this is your argumentation. Basically, use 2 documents to argue your points, your arguments. That was 1 point. Use up to 4 documents, and you get 2 points for that. Then here's your outside evidence. You're going to use at least 1 piece of outside evidence. Basically, use your argument, use outside evidence, and then explain the outside evidence, and then relate that outside evidence to your argument itself for 1 point. And then do that a second time for an additional point for your second piece of outside evidence. And again, this must be found beyond the documents, beyond the 5 documents you're going to get. Okay, for 1 or 2 of the documents, you're going to explain how or why the document's point of view, that is the author or artist's point of view, the POV, their ideology, the purpose of the document, the historical context or situation of the documents, and the audience of the documents. So you're basically going to analyze those documents and use those things, one of those things, to use. I would highly recommend using it for one at least. And then if you understand at least the documents, do it for a second one. For the last point, this is the hardest one. This is your kick-ass essay point. Use evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the prompt. I believe the easiest way to do this, besides just writing a great essay that shows a lot of nuance, is to use synthesis. What is another time period that is very similar to this time period? This is a great way to get your point. You can also compare two different lines of thinking, two different historical reasonings. You can also compare and contrast two different conflicting documents. Again, I believe that those are the best three ways to do this. You can also do it showing both similarities and differences within the prompt, going above and beyond the prompt also in several different ways. But there you go. I will also post the essay and the documents that will be going on this online. So there you go. Good luck. Hopefully this helps a lot of you guys. And be well. This is period 3, part 1 for 1754 to 1786. Have a great day, guys.